Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to program training for the goal of maximizing muscle hypertrophy. Before we can create a program, we first need to understand a few fundamental training variables that are important for hypertrophy training. The first and most important training variable is proximity to failure. This refers to how close a set is taken to the point at which the trainee can no longer perform any more reps. It should be understood that this refers to failure with strict form. If technique breaks down, then the set has already been taken to failure. Proximity to failure is usually quantified using the rate of perceived exertion scale or the reps in reserve scale. These scales simply refer to how many more reps the trainee could have performed before a set was stopped. These scales are handy to understand as it allows us to prescribe a proximity to failure when writing a training program. For hypertrophy training, we want to take each set fairly close to failure to maximize muscle growth. This ensures that all motor units are recruited and meaningfully trained. When lighter loads are used, training should be taken closer to failure on average. This is because lighter loads don't stimulate all muscle fibers from the start of the set, so the low threshold motor units need to fatigue before the high threshold motor units kick in. On the other hand, heavier loads don't need to be taken as close to failure on average, as they will recruit and train all muscle fibers from the start of the set. As a general guide, sets in the rep range of around 6 to 12 only need to be taken around 1 to 3 reps in reserve, while sets in the rep range of around 12 to 20 should be taken around 0 to 2 reps in reserve. This brings us onto the next training variable for muscle hypertrophy, which is rep ranges and load. This refers to what load we should use for each set of an exercise. Since load and rep ranges have an inverse relationship, the load used should naturally be adjusted based on the rep range we select. For hypertrophy training, a large spectrum of rep ranges and loads can equally achieve muscle growth, provided that each set is performed with the appropriate proximity to failure. So anywhere in the 6 to 20 rep range seems to be appropriate for hypertrophy training. Some exercises are better suited to be trained in the higher end of this range, and some are better suited to the lower end. Generally, compound lifts training large muscle groups with high stability demands are best suited to the 6 to 10 rep range, as they are more likely to be limited by central fatigue, rather than local muscle fatigue. On the other hand, isolation lifts training smaller muscle groups with low stability demands are generally best suited to be trained in the 12 to 20 range, as these exercises will never be limited by central fatigue and we want to avoid heavy loading on a single joint. And the last fundamental training variable for hypertrophy is volume. Volume refers to how many sets we train per muscle group per week. Provided that we are training with sufficient proximity to failure and an appropriate rep range, volume appears to be the primary driver of hypertrophy. The volume-hypertrophy relationship isn't fully understood, although it seems that there is some form of an inverted U-shaped relationship. This means that more volume is better up until a point, then performing more volume beyond this most effective level probably doesn't result in as much muscle growth. As established by Dr. Mike Israetel, we can apply some general volume landmarks to this graph. Minimum effective volume, or MEV for short, is the minimum amount of volume required for any muscle growth to occur. Training with less volume than this simply won't result in any muscle growth. Maximum adaptive volume, or MAV for short, refers to the volume that results in the best muscle growth response. And maximum recoverable volume, or MRV for short, refers to the maximum amount of volume that a trainee can recover and adapt to. Training beyond MRV usually results in failure to continue with training progress or injury to occur. These volume landmarks are different for all individuals based on sex, training age, strength levels, body weight, stress levels, and individual lifestyles. These landmarks can also change over time as a trainee becomes more advanced. Therefore, trainees need to experiment with different volumes to see what results in the best muscle growth for them. Here are some general volume ranges for each muscle group for the average intermediate trainee. Now that we have covered the fundamentals of hypertrophy training, we can now start to create a hypertrophy program. The first step is to design the microcycle, which simply refers to 1 week of training. First, we need to establish how much weekly volume will be trained for each muscle group over the week. As we already mentioned, trainees should experiment with how much volume is best for each muscle group specifically for themselves. For this example, let's use the following volumes for each muscle group. So for this example, we will use 16 sets for the chest, 16 sets for the back, 14 sets for the quads, 10 sets for the hamstrings, 8 direct sets for the biceps, 6 direct sets for the triceps, and 8 direct sets for the calves. We haven't included volume for the shoulders or abs, as these muscle groups will already get enough volume from other compound lifts to grow. However, if a trainee wants to emphasize these muscles particularly, then additional volume can be allocated to them if desired. Next, let's discuss frequency. Frequency refers to how many sessions per week the trainee will perform, and how often each muscle group will be trained per week. For this example, let's use a simple 4-day per week upper-lower split. So the trainee will perform 2 upper body sessions and 2 lower body sessions per week. We've also split our volume up over the week. As we can see here, the volume for each muscle group has been split between 2 sessions. The volume for each upper body muscle group has been split equally between days 1 and 3, and the volume for each lower body muscle group has been equally split between days 2 and 4. Now we can implement exercises for each muscle group. Trainees can implement more compound lifts or more isolation lifts based on preference. However, it should be understood that more isolation lifts mean that more total exercises may need to be implemented, while more compound lifts means that training is slightly more efficient. For this example, we can see here that on upper body days, we have chosen the bench press and incline dumbbell press for the chest, pull-ups and seated cable rows for the back, dumbbell curls for the biceps, and cable pushdowns for the triceps. We can also see here that day 1 starts with the chest exercises first, while day 2 starts with the back exercises first. This simply provides a slight variation between sessions. For the lower body days, we have leg press and leg extensions for the quads, stiff leg deadlifts and leg curls for the hamstrings, and calf raises for the calves. Once again, the quads are placed first in the session for day 2, and the hamstrings are performed first in the session for day 4. We have also implemented the volume for each exercise in terms of number of sets. Next, we will need to prescribe what loads to use for each exercise. The load used should correspond to the rough rep range we want to perform the exercise in. As we can see here, we've implemented loads to be used for each exercise. It doesn't matter if the load used doesn't exactly correspond to the desired rep range, as long as it allows the trainee to lift somewhere in the 6 to 20 range. We can also see here that the loads slightly differ for the same exercises on each day. This provides a slight variation from session to session. And the last thing we need to prescribe to complete the microcycle is the proximity to failure. This will be prescribed using the reps in reserve scale, or RIR for short. The RIR doesn't need to be extremely strict, we just need to make sure the trainee is training with roughly the appropriate proximity to failure. As we can see here, RIR ranges have been prescribed for each exercise. The compound lifts generally use a further proximity from failure, while the isolation exercises use a closer proximity to failure. Now that we've created a basic microcycle of training, we can turn this into a mesocycle. A mesocycle is simply a block of training, usually around 3 to 6 weeks long. The mesocycle should consist of one deload week and multiple overloading weeks. The deload week acts as a way to reduce accumulated fatigue for the trainee. The only variable that should change for a deload is total weekly volume. Volume should be reduced to around 50 to 70% of the regular training volume. As we can see here, we've implemented a 4-week mesocycle, with week 1 being a deload. So the volume is the same throughout weeks 2 to 4, but week 1 has been reduced in volume by about 30 to 40%. This has been accomplished by reducing the number of sets performed for each exercise. The other factor we need to consider for the mesocycle is how progressive overload will be applied from week to week. For hypertrophy training, we don't actually need to prescribe progressive overload directly. Instead, we can record how rep performance is changing over time and make adjustments based on the trainee's response. If the trainee is improving performance slowly over time, then the training program is probably effective. If they aren't improving performance, then we may need to adjust volume, proximity to failure, rep ranges, or exercise selection. Let's use the bench press from day 1 as an example. Over the 4-week mesocycle, we keep the load the same, the volume the same, and the proximity to failure the same. Let's say the trainee performs the following reps for each set over the mesocycle. As we can see here, the reps naturally increase slightly over time on average. This suggests that the trainee is improving performance and that the training program is effective. And lastly, let's explore how hypertrophy training can be periodized over time. For hypertrophy training, we don't want to plan training from a long-term perspective. This is because it's impossible to predict the response of the trainee to a particular training protocol. So if we plan too far in advance, the training program may be too much to recover from or not difficult enough to see progress. Therefore, hypertrophy training should be periodized reactively rather than proactively. Based on the response of the individual to a particular training protocol, training can be adjusted to make it more effective for that individual at that time. Let's now explore some example situations of how hypertrophy training can be adjusted from mesocycle to mesocycle. The first strategy we can implement from mesocycle to mesocycle is to actually maintain all variables of the program. So a trainee can actually repeat the exact same program if it was effective. If the trainee saw great progress with a particular mesocycle and they ran into no joint issues or excessive fatigue, then they can simply repeat the mesocycle again and potentially see more progress with the same program. They can then increase loads as well if they want to, or even maintain the same load and see improvements in rep performance. The second strategy we can implement is to increase the total weekly volume for a particular muscle group. This can be implemented if the trainee didn't see improvements in performance for a particular muscle, they felt no joint issues, the muscle hardly got sore at all over the mesocycle, and they felt overall well recovered. The trainee can then try to increase the volume by a small amount in the next mesocycle to see if this allows them to make progress. Volume should only be increased by around 1 to 3 weekly sets from mesocycle to mesocycle to avoid sudden changes in workload to minimize injury risk. The next strategy we can implement is to actually decrease volume. This should be implemented if a trainee didn't see progress or saw decreases in performance and they felt under-recovered or experienced joint pain in the relevant joints. This will probably be an indicator that the trainee is doing too much volume to recover from and may actually see better hypertrophy gains from reducing volume slightly. The trainee can then experiment with reducing volume by 1 to 3 weekly sets and see how they respond in the following mesocycle. And the last strategy a trainee can implement is to change exercises. This should be implemented if the trainee has been performing the same exercise for multiple mesocycles in a row and they initially saw good progress but have now plateaued in performance. It may then be a good idea to change exercises to another similar exercise which targets the same muscle groups. This can allow a new training stimulus that the trainee can adapt to. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.